Isaac. Hello, nice to have you here. You are co-chair of the working group on global dialogue and Bologna implementation. How was today so far?
Well, I would say that today it was a very, very interesting and important meeting because we're getting close to the ministerial conference that will be in Tirana at the end of May. So we're coming up close to having to finalize the work of the preceding work period. And since I am co-chair of two coordination groups, the one on the Bologna Process implementation and the one on global policy dialogue.
Right.
Well, there's lots to think about and to try to gather opinions and ideas of others because the Bologna process and the European higher education area, as you have certainly been told several times today, is based on consensus. And so we build it by listening as well as talking.
Could you go back a bit in time and think about how things were before the Bologna process?
Absolutely, because I was there.
Yes.
Yes, I was actually, I began my studies in Berkeley.
I'm sorry, could you please point that microphone right?
Yeah.
That's better.
I began my studies in the early 60s in Berkeley, and however, I wanted to go to Italy, where I had been as a mobility student of the American Field Service in the first group of young people that were sent to Europe to study when I was 16. And if you can imagine such a thing, we went to Europe on a boat. And today that seems pretty bizarre, but anyway. And I went to Berkeley. At that time, you had to have 2 years of U.S. Higher education to enter the Italian university. That was very high level because it came after long and intense upper secondary studies. And yes, I got my degree from the State University of Milan, and I began my career as a ministerial fellow at the Superior Normal School of Pisa. And then I became a professor of the University of Pisa. And that was in 1975. So at that time, the universities in Europe were very, very, very different. The systems were entirely different. The degree structure in Italy, there was only one level because people already got to the university having a high level of education. So the university was the final part with a research thesis. So it was basically much as a PhD is today. And it was also very much an elite institution that only a small percentage of people were actually enrolled in the university. Right. So it was a completely different system. But then things began to change in various ways. For one thing, because of, upheavals in the 60s and contestation, and the universities needs to be something else. And this was something that was international, starting in Berkeley. Anyway, it put pressure on university systems to have more students, a more open, more modern system. But what for me was a real changer is that we started to develop the ECTS system in 1989. And that was because of the realization that there had to be some way of putting the systems into communication for mobility, because at that time it was the European credit transfer system, the pilot project to create it, and we had to start from zero because we had to figure out some way of measuring what a year was in each of these different systems in order to begin to organize mobility. And the mobility at that time was for 1 year because there were no semesters, there was no way to divide up a year. And but that was a real eye-opener because lots of academics, oh, well, yes, I know in France, I have my colleague, I know in the UK, I have my, but when you actually have students going from one system to another, then you have to realize that the systems are radically different. So that started in '89, and it sort of moved slowly from the pilot project to being a possibility to extend it, and then the Sorbonne came. And that was the meeting of the 4 key ministers that started all this by having this brainstorming in which they said, we brought all this documentation to Paris, but it's useless. And they spent the night brainstorming, more or less, and came up with the idea that there could be some very simple things, common degree structure, a system of credits, and that this would allow students to become mobile in Europe. And this was the basis for the Bologna Declaration.
Would you write something differently in that declaration if you had to do it again?
I don't think so. I mean, why would we? It was brilliant, it turns out, because it turned out to be doable with great determination and real upheavals in many of the systems. That meant completely revolutionizing the existing systems.
What are the key commitments, would you say, within the Bologna process?
Well, what they have, the way we now define them, they are very basic things that more or less have been commitments since the very beginning, but we consider them to be the ones that, if they are implemented by all countries in a compatible way, make it possible to really be connected with diversity, because the idea has never been make all the systems alike. It's always been to preserve the national diversity, national culture, national perceptions and ways of looking at things, but to have these communalities, the degree structure, the credit system, which became in 2000 credit transfer and accumulation system, because it became the system not just for mobility but also for all students that were enrolled in the universities. And so the first key commitment is the qualifications frameworks that allow us some way to define what a bachelor or a master or a doctoral degree is, which in Bologna terms were always the first cycle, the second cycle, and the third cycle, because we didn't want to take on the vocabulary of the UK or the US, but to have a European higher education. But I mean, as time has gone on, everyone has started to speak in terms of BA, MA, PhD. That's the first one. The second one is recognition, reciprocal recognition, and obviously you can't recognize if you don't know what the other person is doing. So there is the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which all our countries have ratified, and some others as well. But anyway, that's the basis with the diploma supplement that gives transparency to certifications and diplomas and qualifications for recognition. Of course, all problems are not solved. The third key commitment, as I'm sure you know, is quality assurance according to the standards and guidelines for European higher education and for quality assurance in European higher education. And they're all connected, because one thing is to have clarity about the structure. Another is to develop trust, and trust depends on the quality assurance. And here there's a very important issue, which is that before Bologna, and for a substantial amount of time after it too, most systems in Europe were organized by, controlled by the Ministry of Education. And so there was no independent quality assurance. There was no, because it was just the ministry says teach this, the ministry pays the teachers, gives the amount of money to the universities to do what they are told to do, and that's it. But with Bologna came the idea of independence, autonomy of the universities, which, well, I mean, if you're autonomous, then you're responsible for what you do with the money and what you teach and so
ups
forth.
and downs.
So if you're autonomous, well, then there has to be accountability. And so there has to be somebody else checking you, because before the ministry says do this, and it checks, did you do this? And this is the case of many countries in the world still today. But this transition has gone on over these years to say, no, universities have this whole area in which they themselves have to decide what the priorities are, and they have to build their relationship with the community. They have to have, which can be the little tiny community right around them, or it can be a larger community, it can be a global community. It depends on decisions and vocation and capabilities of different universities. So they use public funds to an extent according to their strategic aims and decisions. And this, in theory, then is, how to say, verified by independent quality agencies. And there's still challenges in all this, but these are the three commitments: the qualifications frameworks with the credit system, the Lisbon Recognition Convention with the diploma supplement, and the quality assurance according to the ESG, as we call it, the standards and guidelines.
Could you also share some details with us about the Bologna Global Policy Forum?
Very happily, very gladly. That's one of my my real passions. Yes, right from the beginning, of course, many countries were interested in what is this new thing? What is this Bologna declaration? What is this Bologna process? Well, we want to be there too. And in fact, in the Sorbonne, 98, that was 4 countries. And they invited other countries to come to Bologna in June 99. And they themselves were amazed to find that there were 29 countries in Bologna, and many of these were not EU countries. And I think this is very important. From my point of view, this is very important because it means that the other countries recognize the value of being able to interact in this way with other national systems. And I still truly believe that higher education is one place where connection and dialogue can take place even when there are political differences of various sorts. In any case, most of those countries are now EU members, but they were not when the Bologna Declaration was signed. And now, as you know, many other countries are part of the European higher education area. And at the beginning, a number of other countries wanted to imitate Bologna, even countries that were not in Europe. And my personal experience started in being invited to Kyrgyzstan, to Bishkek by the president of Kyrgyzstan, to help them to develop degree programs in business administration and economics, because this was something that before the transition from the Soviet Union, they did not have in those. And so I was there in Bishkek in 2004, and we, with representatives from all the universities, and we worked out competence-based, output-based programs for them to implement. And the interest in Bologna was obviously very, very great. And so they tried to implement reforms along the Bologna lines. And this was going on in other countries too, thanks to the support of the Tempest program and the Alpha program of the European Commission. And after that, I did coordinate 2 big programs in Kyrgyzstan to develop programs in different subject area groups, and they wrote to the Bologna group to ask if they could attend a Bologna meeting as observers. And, well, the answer was no. They were told they could not. And I always remember, because they called me up, Kathy, is this a yes or is it a polite no? And I said, it's an impolite no. That was, why? Because they evidently, this was the London ministerial meeting in 2007. And however, and it's appropriate that we're here in Belgium, at the Leuven ministerial conference in 2009, they were invited with another 19 countries, so a little tiny Kyrgyzstan, but also with Japan, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and India, and whatever. Japan, I think I already said. Anyway, so that meant that there had been a change. There had been the idea that, yes, there could be the first Bologna Policy Forum. And the reason for having the word policy is obviously that the Bologna Process and subsequently the European higher education area is based on ministerial cooperation, and so it deals with policy. So it isn't, in their terms, just dialogue on whatever you like about higher education, but it is policy level. Okay, so that was the beginning of the Bologna Policy Fora, and I was very happy that this happened. And when in 2018 I became vice chair of the Bologna follow-up group in the working period between the Paris communique and the Rome communique, I really wanted to develop the policy dialogue, and Paris gave the input of changing from Bologna policy dialogue to global policy dialogue. And this recognizes the fact that when we started, there was only Bologna as a model, whereas now there are other macro regions that have developed their cooperation to quite a high level, or at least they try to. So it becomes that the European higher education area is a partner in a global dialogue with other macro regions. And so it doesn't have to be doing self-propaganda anymore. It might sometimes have that kind of tendency, but this is a time in the world, in my view, for working to make the different macro regions compatible. And this is also very much in the line of the UNESCO efforts in updating the regional conventions that already existed, but also in the design and activation now, the entry into force, as they say, of the UNESCO Global Convention on the Recognition of Higher Education Qualifications. And so it seems that we have a synergy here. We have the opportunity of trying to develop something like we did in Europe in the 90s. That is saying, look, it's an advantage if our systems can be in connection with each other. They don't have to be the same. They must not be the same, but they have to be recognizable, explainable, understandable. They have to have certain parameters that we agree on so that we can connect our systems and have the benefit of mobility, which, well, let's say that it's one of the most important things, in my view, for people being able to understand each other is having the experience of being in an active learning mindset in another country, where there are other beliefs, perspectives, and backgrounds.
Yes, that is true. Which would you say are the main ideas that the BFUG is proposing for the GP statement?
The coordination group on global policy dialogue proposes to continue to try to develop our constant dialogue with the other macro regions and organizations, And of course, we have to deal with the fact that it's not that easy to bring people together from far away or to go to visit them. We need funding and support for that, but we have been able to organize a number of very meaningful meetings, either attending meetings in other parts of the world or organizing joint meetings in Europe when other macro regions hold their meetings in Europe. So we've done that with EHEA, which are African quality agencies, with ASEF, which is the Asia-Europe Foundation, and with ULAC, which is the Europe, Latin American, Caribbean Summit, which I was able to attend and speak at last heavens, May or June. Maybe I've forgotten. But anyway, we have tried to find themes of common interest, and we found out a lot about the other areas, that they do have different priorities, even though we share the priority of trying to reach the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Great, thank you very much for being with us today, and I hope everything goes as planned, and lots of luck.
Well, thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful or can be of interest to someone.
I hope so. You just
I keep this?